15th of May is known to Palestinians and Palestinian activists as Nakba Day, Nakba standing for Catastrophe, as it's the day that marks the fleeing and expulsion of over 700,000 Palestinians from Palestine, and the day after, pretty much the day after the foundation of the State of Israel. The rest of the day is history, so we could talk all day and all night about that. So in commemoration of this day, as it is commemorated by Palestinian activists and Palestinians, I caught up with the author Dave Cronin that I mentioned. He's a contributor to the website Electronic Intifada, and he is also author of that book that I mentioned, Europe's Alliance with Israel Aiding the Occupation. And it is in particular about that I caught up with Dave, and this is what Dave had to say about it all. Dave Cronin, you're the author of the book Europe's Alliance with Israel Aiding the Occupation, and you're also a contributor to the website Electronic Intifada. Now, the title of the book itself says a lot. Could you elaborate on that? Why or how is it that you feel that Europe is aiding Israel's occupation in Palestine?
Sure. The reason why I wrote the book, first of all, is there was a lot of information available about the relationship between the United States and Europe. Obviously, Noam Chomsky and various other people have written an enormous amount on this subject, but there was almost nothing available from a critical perspective about the relationship between the European Union and Israel. So I felt that there was a need to redress this. European Union representatives constantly harp on about the respect for human rights, and in the particular context of the Middle East, they try to convey the impression that they act as an honest broker. First of all, they emphasize the fact that they are the largest trading partner with Israel, but they're also the largest donor of aid to the Palestinian Authority, and that they use those two facts. But if you examine things in even a little bit more detail, even if you just scratch a tiny bit behind the surface, you realise that the European Union is essentially on the side of Israel. It's not at all neutral.
Yeah. Now, so you say that effectively the European Union is taking the side of Israel and takes Israel's side in terms of the occupation. Israelis could respond to that by saying at the recent vote on Palestinian status at the United Nations, there was a huge number of European Union states that voted in favour of Palestine.
That's correct, but if you look at the sequence of events there was something very important that almost nobody noticed. Just a few days before Israel attacked Gaza in November of last year, there was a major exhibition for weapons manufacturers in Tel Aviv. Who sponsored that exhibition? The European Union sponsored it. Specifically, the European Commission sponsored that exhibition. I think that was a very clear endorsement for Israel, the Israeli economy, for Israel's policy of aggression towards the Palestinians, and it took place just on the eve of the Gaza attack. I think that's a much more concrete expression of support for Israel than the symbolic vote really that took place in the United Nations. Of course, Palestine has been awarded the status of a non-observer member state of the United Nations. It's really a symbolic step. In my view, it doesn't change things on the ground. Okay. And in fact, it's a concrete example of the double standards that I was talking about earlier, where the European Union claims to be balanced, claims to be neutral. Does the complete opposite. If you look at what European Union diplomats are saying, the reason why they decided to vote in favour of a Palestinian state at the United Nations, it was probably to give support to Mahmoud Abbas. The European Union has decided that it wants him to remain in that place. That the European Union wants to basically select the leaders of the Palestinian Authority. They won't. The colonial mentality has become so entrenched in the European Union that they won't even allow the Palestinians to select who their own leaders are.
Okay, yeah. So there's still interference even when the Palestinians vote for groups like Hamas, then Hamas aren't accepted. Yeah, and recently Jimmy Carter lent his voice to the labelling of products that are produced in the settlements in the West Bank. How would you view as a move like that? Where is that going to place Palestine on the world stage?
I'll say two things in relation to that. First of all, there's nothing wrong with labelling. Of course, consumers should have clear information about where food that they buy in their local supermarket comes from. There's a more fundamental issue here. These goods shouldn't be in our supermarkets to begin with. While Jimmy Carter's call is welcome insofar as it highlights this issue, we should be campaigning for, not for labelling, but for an outright ban of these products. To its credit, the Irish government has put this issue on the agenda of the European Union. That doesn't mean, however, that the Irish government is as forceful or as vociferous in criticising Israeli policies as it should be.
Okay, thanks very much to Dave Cronin. As I said, he's a contributor to Electronic Intifada, and he is also author of the book Europe's Alliance with Israel Aiding the Occupation. Okay, now the first wave of modern Jewish migration to the Ottoman-ruled Palestine, known as the First Aliyah, began in 1881. Jews fled pogroms in Eastern Europe. After World War II, Britain found itself in fierce conflict with the Jewish community as the Haganah joined the Irgun and led an armed struggle against British rule. Then some years later, the 29th of November 1947, obviously giving a very brief overview here of the region, the United Nations General Assembly recommended the adoption and implementation of a partition plan. And on the 14th of May 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the executive head of the World Zionist Organization and president of the Jewish Agency, declared the establishment of the Jewish State of Israel. And I'm joined on the line in commemoration of that by Dermot Malidi, the information officer of the Israeli Embassy in Dublin. Good afternoon to you, Dermot.
Hello, how are you?
Very good, very good. So, as you gather, it was a very, very brief and a very rough overview of the establishment of the State of Israel, which the date commemorated on is the 14th of May. Now, indeed, it's a topic much discussed in international and national politics, not so much on community radio, so we'll take that approach to it. I suppose an initial question for you is, wasn't it possible, or what's your position, for the Jewish people to live side by side and in harmony with their Arab neighbours in an Israeli state without the need for the expulsion or the fleeing of 700,000 plus Palestinians?
Well, you're presuming that there was an expulsion. I would question whether that actually happened. The date that you mentioned, the 29th of November 1947, when the UN General Assembly voted to partition Palestine and create two states, one a Jewish state and the other a Palestinian Arab state, there had been warnings from the Arab world in the run-up to that any partition was going to lead to bloodshed. I've got in front of me here a page from the Irish Times from 4 days earlier, bloodshed warning by Arabs, a warning that any partition would spill the blood of Jews, not only in Palestine but in other Arab countries, was made by the Egyptian delegate Mohammed Hussein Hevkal Pasha at Lake Success yesterday. In other words, this was a warning from the Arab leadership, the wider Arab leadership, that any partition, in other words, the creation of any Jewish state, would cause a war. Now, when the very day after the UN General Assembly passed that resolution, the attacks began on Jews all around Palestine. And the death toll, in the first 3 months, the death tolls were running at around 2 to 1. In other words, twice as many Jews were being killed by Arabs as Arabs by Jews. In the early months of 1948, the Jews began to fight back, or began to be more successful, if you like, in self-defense, and the tide began to turn. So we can't begin the narrative in May 1948 with the Declaration of Independence. There had been a civil war raging for 6 months beforehand, and I'm afraid to say that civil war was initiated by the Arab side. The Jewish leaders accepted the state, the Jewish state, which had been carved out of part of Palestine, but the local Arabs and the wider Arab world rejected they rejected an Arab state for the simple reason that they rejected the presence of any Jewish state alongside them. Now, what happened then, the war that was subsequently triggered and which lasted for over a year, led to the flight of over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs. There were certainly some expulsions among that number. If we had the time, I could go into more detail about the phases in which those Palestinian Arabs fled. But to summarise it, we could say that from the reports of the time and from documents of the time, we could say that of the 720,000 roughly Arabs who fled, about between 100 and 150,000 were actually expelled. Now, this was not because the Jewish leadership had any policy of expelling the Arab population, but simply because they were in the middle of a war. There was a war which was particularly intensely fought for the road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. The fighting was very intense there in April and May of 1948, and again in July. And there were villages which had been turned into, there were Arab villages which had been turned into armed fortresses by the Arab side, and these were commanding the heights overlooking the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The Jewish convoys which were trying to bring supplies to the Jewish population of Jerusalem were being fired on and stopped and been killed by the Arab fighters in the villages overlooking them. To clear that road and to make sure that the supplies got through, the Jewish Defence Forces did expel the inhabitants of those villages. Lida and Ramla, in particular, are two. That happened in July 1948. But there was at no stage was there a policy by the government or by the armed forces of Israel to expel the Palestinian population. And the best evidence of that is the fact that very large Arab communities remained. The fact that Nazareth, to this day, is a majority Arab city is testimony to the fact that there was no overall policy of expulsion. Mm-hmm. So I'm afraid that when we hear about the Nakba, we're talking about a tragedy, all right. It's certainly a tragedy, and I wouldn't want to minimize the significance of the tragedy for the Arab-Palestinian people, but unfortunately, it's a self-inflicted tragedy.
Okay, now if you could take on that point of the some say expulsions, you say that you would question the idea of expulsions. Maybe we could question the idea. I mean, why was there a need for an Israeli state to begin with? Why wasn't it possible just for all groups to live side by side within the state, within the arrangement that had already existed?
Well, the record was not good in that respect. We had in 1920, we had the Nabi Musa riots, which were these were religious Jews who were worshipping at the Western Wall. Many of them were not even Zionists. They were Jews who lived in Jerusalem. Just remember that there had been a Jewish majority in Jerusalem from as early as the 1830s. Mm-hmm. But some of these Jews had lived there. They were many generations of the family had lived there. They were worshipping, and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem orchestrated Arab rioting, and it ended up massacring scores of Jewish worshippers. Mm-hmm. Then again, Hebron, which often features in the news today, 1929, there was a massacre there. Once again, the Hebron Jewish community had lived there unbroken for 2,000 years. They weren't Zionist newcomers. They were Jews who'd been there forever, and they were massacred. 133 Jews right throughout the land of Palestine were killed in those riots, including 67 in Hebron itself. That was in 1929. In 1937, the British government had set up a commission called the Peel Commission, and that advocated setting up a tiny little Jewish enclave on the west coast, which would have amounted to about 18% of the land of Palestine. That the Arab leadership rejected that outright and launched attacks, and that led to a 3-year revolt. The record was not the Jewish Zionist people who went to live who immigrated into the territory from the late 19th century did not want conflict with the Arabs, and they didn't take anything from them. Any land that they had, they purchased, but their presence was simply not welcome. And when it became a question of, wanting a political homeland, like wanting a national homeland, that was simply a red line for the not for all of the Arab Palestinians, but for the leadership.
Sure. Now, Dermot, of course, as you outlined, there were atrocities committed against the Jewish people, and in the intervening years there have been several atrocities committed against the Arab people in the region.
Sure.
And in addition to that, what a lot of people what's the most obvious thing in the region is the 25-foot high security wall, the need for permits and passes for Palestinians to get from, to put it in Irish terms, to get from the equivalent of, say, Drumcondra to Ballsbridge, getting 3-day passes and so on and so forth. I mean, how much longer can that go on? How much longer is that sustainable?
12 years ago, there was no wall, no security fence. And by the way, the wall makes up about 4% of the total security barrier. But 12 years ago, there wasn't any such thing there. And the checkpoints and so on were few and far between in the West Bank. So what's made the difference? It's not, this myth persists among the Israel-hating community that Jewish Israelis get up in the morning and try to figure out another way of making life, as bad as possible or as annoying as possible for Palestinians.
Right.
It doesn't work that way. Something very important called the Second Intifada happened between 2000. It fizzled out around 2008, but during that 8-year interval, suicide bombers had been coming across from the West Bank into Israel in waves. The worst year was 2002, when several hundred Israeli civilians were blown up by suicide bombers. That explains the wall, or if you want to call it the wall. Mm-hmm. It explains the security barriers. Now, since it fizzled out 4 years ago, the large number of checkpoints which were made necessary in the West Bank have been reduced. There are still certainly checkpoints. They're still a nuisance. They add nothing to the quality of anybody's life. Yeah. But unfortunately, they have to be understood in the context.
Yeah. Do you see them remaining for a considerable time to come? The walls.
They wouldn't be there for another day if there were, if there could be peace negotiations in which the Palestinians. Leadership would actually come to the table, as the Israeli leadership have been inviting them to do for several years now, and that's not even counting the number of actual offers that have come from the Israeli leadership.
Okay.
Going back to Camp David under Bill Clinton in 2000, they were offered 94% of the West Bank as an independent state. Yes. Yasser Arafat chose to walk away from that and began the Intifada instead.
Okay. Now, Dermot, before we let you go, and there's as you know yourself, there's a million other topics we can talk about, and we will talk about a couple of them when we have you on again. During the week, and the last week and a half, the organisation called the Elders, consisting of Mary Robinson, Jimmy Carter, among others. Jimmy Carter made reference to the labelling of products made in Israeli settlements in the West Bank. How do you feel about this idea and what people have to say about labelling? Well, the labelling, the mention of this labelling policy is intended to encourage a boycott, one presumes. That's the idea. I mean, they should be careful what they wish for, because it may result in, when people see the origin of goods produced by the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, it may make them, it may encourage them to buy those goods rather than discourage them. But that's probably a side issue. Now, the intention is to boycott. Europe has a 2,000-year-old legacy of singling out Jewish communities, and it would be unfortunate. We thought up to a few years ago that this tradition had been left behind. It would be very unfortunate if it were to begin again in Europe, if we were to have Jewish, of all of the areas in the world where there are disputes over territory, like say Morocco and Western Sahara, or China, Tibet, and so on, that of all of those conflict areas, that the Jews from the ancestral Jewish homeland in Judea and Samaria should be singled out for special treatment and for discrimination. So this move by the elders is, whatever else it is, it's not a move towards peace. It will only encourage the most extreme elements among the Palestinians, and it will also antagonize the majority of the Israeli population, who in every single opinion poll have shown that they are ready for painful compromises if there were serious negotiations for a peace agreement. And by painful compromises, I mean that a majority of Israelis would be willing to
to look at the removal of many of the settlements.
Okay.
Certainly not all, but a substantial number, as Israel did when it made a peace agreement with Egypt over the. It took out all the settlements from the Sinai Peninsula, and then it withdrew all the Jewish settlements from Gaza, which happened 8 years ago.
All right, that's fine.
So there is a record there of compromise.
Okay, great. We're pretty much out of time there. Dermot Malidi, Information Officer of the Israeli Embassy, thank you very much for joining us, and I'm sure we'll be talking to you again.
Thanks, Peter.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye. That's great. So great to hear from Dermot there, as well as from Dave Cronin.